Hello and welcome to a new episode of Minds Between Languages. Joining us today is Michaela Albl-Mikasa, who will be talking about English as a lingua franca and what it means for interpreters. Hello and welcome to Minds Between Languages. It's good to have you, Michaela.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Anne-Kathrin, and nice to see you in this kind of setting.
Right, thanks. So everybody speaks English. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think everybody believes they do. And in fact, we have about a quarter of the world's population who do speak English, but 3/4 of them are non-native speakers. So you can imagine that there is a twist to it, as it were. I've actually been looking up the EF English Proficiency Index. And according to that, the proficiency levels, they vary greatly. And we know this. We all know this. We know that proficiency levels in Scandinavia are different to countries like in Africa or some Arabic countries. But what is even more interesting is that they say the proficiency levels haven't really changed over the past decade, even though there has been a lot of investment in pushing it up. And I was quite amazed to see that the reasons given are, I think, very interesting. They say it's the challenge of language acquisition, which I quite like. Then there are also pandemic-related restrictions. And then apparently there is growing confidence. People are, questioning the cultural hegemony of Western education. So this leads in a drop of students in US universities from China, South Korea, etc. I've actually noticed this in Japan recently. I've just been there for a visiting professorship in October. It was very interesting. I mean, in international hotels, you would find that, basic operations, which you would do in any kind of hotel to get things organized, have been quite difficult. The personnel, they were going back to apps and trying to find an answer there, and that wouldn't always work. They would go back to cleaning personnel from Nepal. So proficiency levels aren't really what one would expect them to be. And therefore I would say perhaps not. Perhaps not everybody speaks English, at least not to the extent that we would expect it to or hope to.
So 1/4 of native speakers, 3/4 of non-native speakers is varying degrees of language proficiency. Well, what's the problem about that?
There's no problem. Actually, this is what ELF research makes us believe. So ELF research portrays ELF as very effective, well-functioning communication. When I started out getting involved in ELF research, that was at the University of Tübingen. I had done interpreting studies at the University of Heidelberg, and because of my supervisor shifting to the University of Tübingen, I was actually involved in English as lingua franca research and not in interpreting and translation anymore. The research community on ELF, which I got involved with, a canonical ELF research, they were actually portraying ELF, as I said, as very effective and as a very well-functioning tool.
ELF means English as a lingua franca.
That's right. Yes, yeah. That's the acronym for English as a lingua franca. In this context, I would actually like to mention Kurt Kohn. He was the supervisor of my PhD at the time. The PhD was in interpreting studies. He's the one that, like older colleagues of TIS, they might still know. He's the one who collaborated with Silvia Kalina. They ushered in the strategic cognitive turn in interpreting studies. And he got me involved in ELF research. And that kind of research is very much on conversational dialogues, which you would find in corpora, like the voice corpus of the University of Vienna. And when I had the chance to go back to interpreting studies at ZHW, at our university, I was astounded to see that interpreters, interpreting students, interpreting trainers, they would actually speak of ELF in different terms. They would not find it such effective a tool. They would actually find it disturbing at conferences. So this got me interested into looking into what the problems were. And basically what we can say is the fact that there are so many non-native speakers means that ELF communication is basically the unpredictable use of various Englishes, not of English, of various Englishes, of various idiolects that they bring to the conference table. And there is a lot of hybridity, variability, ad hoc formations of non-conforming expressions and structures, etc. And that is a fundamental problem together with others that follow from it.
So various Englishes, but then on the other hand, there are also a lot of varieties in English. American,
Yes.
Irish, Indian English. For some, they can be quite a little bit unpredictable, maybe too, at least difficult to understand, right? What's the difference between this kind of variety and then the English spoken by a non-native speaker?
Yeah, indeed. There are a lot of varieties out there. As you say, there are the native speaker varieties, and then there are the so-called world Englishes like Singapore or Nigerian English. And perhaps the difference is that those varieties, they follow certain norms and patterns. And often it's very much a matter of accent, as you say. The accents are very different. If you look at American accent versus British accent, etc. With ELF, it's a little bit different. And indeed, ELF is defined as not a variety. ELF is defined as an open source phenomenon. I sometimes speak of a pick and choose phenomenon because due to the limitations of the non-native speakers, they pick from whatever resources they have available, but they do not have, the kind of repertoire to really choose what they and in order to express what they want to say. So I think that is a fundamental difference. And early ELF researchers, they were actually out to conceptualize ELF as a variety. And they soon found there's too much fluidity. As I said, there's too much heterogeneity, variability, etc. It's too diverse, with people coming from all over the world and bringing in their Englishes. So it was impossible to kind of describe, even codify it as you could with some of the varieties. This led to a situation now where people are more looking at the functions that ELF plays in various settings. And therefore, ELF is now defined as a mode of communication in international settings, where people come together who do not share a common language. And those people can be native speakers. The native speakers are included. They can be English as a second or foreign language speakers. But at the center of research are really the non-native speakers. These are the ones that bug the interpreters. These are the ones, that are really giving trouble and problems, because accent is a matter which you will find with native as with non-native speakers. That is always give rise to difficulties. But there are so many other phenomena that are associated with non-native speakers, so that this is really what gets the interpreters up in arms against ELF.
Now, you conducted yourself a rather large study on ELF, and to find out also what are the effects actually of ELF on interpreting, more specifically. Can you give us a brief overview about the study?
You're referring to CLINT. CLINT is the acronym for Cognitive Load in Interpreting and Translation. And it was a 4-year project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, concluded last year. And you, Anne-Catherine, you came in midway as the postdoc in our interpreting team. So from then onwards, you were involved in every step of it. So if I miss out on an important fact, just step in. It is, as you know, a distinctly interdisciplinary project. So we were not only getting together, us, the interpreting team, with the translation team at our university at ZHW. So that is the team led by Marien Ehrensberger-Dow at the time. because we wanted to look into spoken and written Elf, which hadn't really been done before. But we also got together with the neuropsychologists at the University of Zurich under Lutz Jenke, and also Stefan Elmer. He was involved, and a couple of PhD students. So it was really a very much interdisciplinary project. As I mentioned, I was kind of eager to find out why the interpreters were complaining about ELF. What really was it that bugged them so much? So we wanted to design a project that would look into the differences in processing ELF versus non-ELF. In terms of processing problems, cognitive load, coping strategies, general challenges, all of this. And there wasn't much in the literature at the time to guide us because, as I said, ELF in relation to interpreting and translation was pretty new. Not much work had been done. We started comparing interpreters, translators, multilinguals who were not trained in interpreting and translation, and from different levels of expertise, BA students, MA students, professionals. And we looked into how they would deal with ELF as opposed to non-ELF texts. For that purpose, we collected authentic input material. We went to real-life conferences, one in Switzerland, one in China. We recorded the presentations. We collected the abstracts that were submitted with it. So we had spoken and written material and source input. We selected one text of each of the two conferences. One was of a more general nature, the one from the Swiss conference, one of a more technical nature, the one from the China conference. And I think what was perhaps an innovation was that we used our authentic ELF material and edited it to conform to native speaker norms. And in that way, we really ended up with two versions, an ELF and an edited version of two texts, a more general and a more technical one. This was the input, the source input that we used for our tests and quasi experiments. And one more perhaps specific feature of the project was that the same participants which were recruited, they went to both settings. So there was a setting at our university, the simulated workplace tasks, where we set up interpreting task and translation task as you would have them more or less in real life. And then also they went to the lab of the neuropsychologists for EEG measurements. Those same participants. So we got a bigger picture. The neuropsychologists, they very much applied EEG and some self-assessment tasks. We had a wide range of methods to elicit the various indices of cognitive load that we were interested in. So performance-based, behavioral, physiological, self-report. And we had a lot of data collected via audio, video recording, eye tracking. The translators, they used key logging and also eye tracking. And then we had physiological measurements like the heart rate measurements with the Apple Watch, stimulated recall commentaries and post-task interviews. So it was really a whole range of methods that we applied, a whole range of different data that we collected in order to look at those differences in processing between ELF and edited English. And also we did product analyses, which I think, were very revealing.
Now, native speakers, you said you were interested into the effects of ELF and, what is bothering interpreters with ELF, with non-native speakers, but native speakers can be challenging too, can't they?
Yes, they can be challenging indeed.
And maybe my question would be, what are specific difficulties for interpreters when they interpret a non-native speaker versus a native speaker then? Are there differences in difficulties?
I should think so, yes. First of all, as I mentioned, you have those proficiency levels, which are very different, that you would not find with native speakers, would you? And the tricky thing is perhaps that when interpreters go into a conference, they just don't know what they will be confronted with. So they can have anything from very good English to kind of rudimentary English, and that makes it a kind of difficult. Another thing is with non-native speakers, what you very often have is transfer phenomena from their L1. So we all know this, especially from our weaker languages. You know, you start when you have a very weak language, all you can do is translate kind of literally from your L1. And you have no other way of expressing yourself idiomatically. And that brings about a situation where you have all those collocations and idiomatic expressions from various languages of the world, which are then literally translated. I keep bringing up this example of the Germans who say, this is not the yellow of the egg. And obviously, if you are an interpreter interpreting from English into Spanish, French, Italian, and you do not have German as one of your languages, it will be very difficult for you to trace it back to the underlying structure. Imagine this in a conference to be the case from various languages out there. So this is something which is quite different and which also is related to proficiency levels, because you know the lower the proficiency level, the more transfer will obviously happen. Also, this can add to imported load. I really find this concept that Daniel Gilles introduced very interesting, because if you are preoccupied in comprehending the source text and you have these kinds of phenomena, and you are preoccupied figuring them out, this may actually, kick the can down the road, as it were. So imported load, that is the preoccupation with difficult structures in one sentence, impacting processing of the next, as you know. And I think this is very much something that is involved when we are dealing with non-native speakers. Something which also Daniel Gilles mentions, the translinguistic correspondences between language pairs. I kept speaking of the mental translation memory because I think the interpreter and the translator builds up over time a kind of translation memory of translation routines, translation links between equivalents in the specific language pairs. This gets more and more retained and automatized. And we know from cognitive psychology that the moment the input doesn't match or only partially the equivalent stored, it will be much more difficult to activate and retrieve that equivalent. So these routines, which are usually automatized, which you can just spit out, they will be much more difficult to retrieve, to bring back, to bring out. This is also something you would not find with native speakers. There are other things too, like text organization. And when you say that native speakers, they can be difficult too, it has been said that non-native speakers can be easier to interpret, for instance, because sometimes they speak slower, or maybe even often they speak slower. But we also find that slow speech can even be disruptive. It can be full of hesitations. In that way, it can disrupt the interpreting flow, or sometimes you have to wait for something to come, or non-native speakers are searching for a lexical item. They have even called this brain stoppers, the interpreters in interviews, because they feel it can really, disrupt their flow. So I would believe that it is fair to say that there are a number of specific difficulties linked to non-native speakers as opposed to native speaker talk.
Now, you mentioned cognitive load, the concept of cognitive load. You mentioned brain stoppers, non-native speakers as brain stoppers. Was it possible for you in the study to observe this cognitive load and the effects of higher cognitive load on the interpreters?
Yeah, as you know, it's only in an indirect way that you can look at cognitive load, or actually speaking, we can more look at the effort that interpreters invest, not so much at cognitive load itself. What we did was we used those various measurements. It was interesting to see that really when the EEG measurements were taken, there were no it wasn't possible to put it down on the theta markers or whatever markers they have there. So they couldn't really find robust evidence for this issue in the EEG, but in the lab of the neuropsychologists, they could see that in the self-assessment tasks, which followed the subtasks, participants actually did speak of higher cognitive load. They said, they felt the ELF task was more difficult than the edited version of the task. So there were at least some indicators of cognitive load there. Also in our self-report results, there was a lot of hinting at cognitive load or at things being more difficult when the ELF version was the input. What I found very interesting is the performance-based analysis. We could see there were significant differences between the ELF version and the edited version. So one particular indicator was the drop in accuracy, and that is something which you actually looked very much into. And you found that there is, when the professionals, at least with the technical text, when the professionals were dealing with the technical text, there was a significant drop of accuracy over time with the professional interpreters. What I also found very interesting, because that is something I attended to, was the relevance theory-based analysis. And there we could show that in both texts, the general and the technical one, there was a lot more interventions when interpreters were interpreting from the ELF rather than the edited text. So, they were specifying more, they were disambiguating more, they were enriching the source text much more. So there were many more completions and interventions from the ELF text. And I think it's pretty plausible to say that when interpreters have to indulge in all these completions, interventions, whatever, more than with the edited text, it should show in cognitive effort. It takes more effort to do that. So yes, I think we did find some indications of higher cognitive load, or at least higher cognitive effort. The translators too, they found significant differences in their effort indicators. Just briefly, they looked at the number of keystrokes, deletions, mouse clicks, internet browser visits, pauses, and they could show us that there are really differences there.
So this leads us actually also to the next question. What do interpreters do when they need to interpret a non-native speaker? So you mentioned already these completions, enrichments, additions that they seem to do in a way. Are there other strategies that they apply in this context?
Yes, there are other strategies. We actually conducted an international survey, as you know. And we had some 900 responses from translators and post-editors and community and conference interpreters. That also was part of the CLIN project. They spoke, first of all, which I think is very interesting, they really mentioned that the majority of their texts nowadays are produced by non-native speakers. And this goes to show that ELF is really an issue to reckon with. This is really something that we have to look into, and that interpreters and translators are confronted with. The other thing is that they said is that they associated non-native input with poorer text quality. And the questions were asked in a fashion, in an order, and perhaps also in a way where they also where we also asked about, what makes native speaking text difficult or poor, what is a poor native speaker text, etc. So they weren't let it all into being biased towards ELF or against ELF, and yet we could find that they did associate ELF text with poorer quality. So that is the background, and against this they said they do use general strategies like inferring meaning from the situation, engaging in sense making, etc. And also, they did explicitly say that they consciously invest extra effort. And this not only for better understanding the source text, but for actually rectifying and improve it. And this, for me, it is kind of matching what we found in the relevance theory-based study, because that is improvement. That is, doing something to the source text to make it more relevant, to make it better understandable, to make it more easily accessible to the audience. So this is optimization. This is improvement. Setten and Davron, in their book, they speak about optimization as part and parcel of the interpreting task. And I would go so far as to say that the results would tend to show that optimization is something interpreters have to or indulge in even more when they are faced with ELF input.
So they try to improve the text, and they do so by applying different strategies and also by investing a little bit more effort than they would do usually.
Yes, absolutely. And by then really trying to, complete the source text, make it more explicit, making it more easily accessible to the target audience, to their listeners.
So based on your research and based maybe on the survey and on all these comments that interpreters were making, where they explained how they coped with non-native speakers, what advice would you give to interpreters who need to interpret non-native speakers?
I think it's very basic. I think there is no point, bemoaning the unfavorable conditions. You just have to accept the growing number of non-native speakers and the varying proficiency levels, the new conditions that you are faced with. So basically, the advice would be keep calm and keep going. And that this is something we find that interpreters keep also saying. What they could perhaps do is invest even more in preparation. So one thing they might want to do is, for instance, make more effort to really get documentation, to get information about the kind of participants you get, and then find out more, like in the proficiency level index, find more about where they come from, what proficiency levels to expect, what accents to expect, that kind of thing. Obviously, you will find very good speakers and not so good speakers anywhere. Mm-hmm. But maybe you get a rough idea, and maybe it takes you less by surprise if you go down that road. Another thing is, and that is perhaps key, and that is exposure. Karin Reithofer, she used her data from her PhD and looked at it again, or in a slightly different way, and she found that exposure to ELF speakers is something that helps a lot, even more than domain-specific knowledge, for instance. So the more you are confronted, or the more you deal with ELF speakers from the various regions in the world, the more easy you will find it to deal with them. And as you know, this is why at ZHW we have introduced ELF modules. We have block sessions over 2 semesters, so sessions on European, African, Asian ELF. And we co-teach with the practicing interpreting trainers. So we confront the students with speeches from those various areas, with ELF speeches. They do the interpretation, and then we discuss the results, and also they get a theoretical input on the specificities of the regional similects, as they are called. So exposure is perhaps something that, and which is nowadays with the internet, it's not so difficult to do. So that is something that interpreters might really want to get their hands on.
To listen to some YouTube video by maybe the same speaker or maybe a different speaker but the same region that might have a very
TED
similar...
speeches whatsoever, and the European Parliament. There are a number of platforms where you can find those kinds of speeches.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there anything that maybe individuals who have not this translation and interpreting background could learn from interpreters in this respect?
Yeah, maybe not so much from the interpreters, but maybe from our ITELF studies. ITELF, the interdiscipline between translation and interpreting studies, and ELF research, which has been developing on the basis of what we've just discussed. So from ITELF more generally, perhaps we can say that it depends on the individuals. So for instance, if you have conference organizers, we would really recommend them for their technical conferences to contract interpreters if they want their event to be successful, because as you know, and as we have seen, technical texts, when they are presented by ELF speakers, they can really give rise to a lot of problems for the listeners. So interpreters being trained for that, they are much better equipped to deal with that, and it might be really good for the conference organizers to keep that in mind. For the speakers, I would perhaps say, don't be too naive about assuming that your school or travel in English will actually serve the purpose of negotiation and decision making. It was very interesting for me to see in Japan that two colleagues, they conducted a study, they could in the context of business ELF. And they could show that Japanese business people or people, they tend to much more rely on interpreters because of the insecurities associated with ELF. They felt much better, and they much more often relied on interpreters. And in Europe, it's just the other way around. People think, they can make do with whatever English they bring to the table. They are not aware so much that this can really undermine the very purpose for which they are there. And you will find technical experts, you will find engineers with rather poor English, thinking that they can make do with English. And in Japan, it's the other way around. So they are much more aware, which may be due perhaps to language typological differences. So Japanese and English being very different, they don't so easily feel that they can manage. It's a very interesting study, and perhaps speakers should be a little bit more aware, as the Japanese people seem to be, that they are not always up to the task. And business people, yes, ELF is a practical tool, as we all know, as they know. It would be good for them to understand that it comes with a cost. And the cost is more cognitive effort, less efficiency in communication. It's more difficult to participate. Participation is key. So if you're not up to language-wise to the task, how will you participate in a way where, as you say, you can negotiate your cause? Getting heard, positioning yourself, all that is involved. And you can also become tired. You can become stressed. So at least keep this in mind, and perhaps figure out that there may be events, there may be contexts where you are better off with an interpreter. And then learners of English, I'm often asked at events, especially by Asian students, interpreting students, they keep asking me, do I have to be native-like in accent and otherwise? And I would like to refer really to Kurt Cohn's My English Approach, which is very interesting indeed in the context of ELF, which is also of relevance in our context. It's a social constructivist perspective. And from that perspective, he makes it very clear that there just is no other way of learning English than to create your own version of English in your mind, heart, and behavior. That's the only way to learn a language from a cognitive stance. And what does that mean? That means that it depends on your satisfaction, your requirements, how and to what extent you want to learn this English. So this language. Who do you want to be in exchanges? Where do you want to go in learning? How much are you willing to invest? What are your requirements? The performance, learning, ultimate competence, all that depends on your personal requirements. And that means depending on where you want to go with your language, and you should keep that in mind. If you are an interpreter and you want to have an English B, you better, push your requirements high. There's no other way if you want to have it as a B language. So I think, yes, from our ITELF research, we can perhaps, different stakeholders, different individuals can perhaps take those little recommendations for them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this interview, for your time, and yeah, hope to see you again soon.
We definitely will, Ann-Kathrin, and I thank you too.